Welcome back to the Gentleman's Gazette. In today's video interview, I speak with Pedro Mendes, who is from Toronto. He has Portuguese roots. He loves radio, soccer, and men's clothing. And he is the mastermind behind the Hogtownrake, which is a personal style approach to people in Toronto. Pedro, welcome.
Hello, Raphael. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. I like that you have a very different approach to things. And just for our readers, listeners, and viewers to get to know you a little better, tell us more about yourself.
Okay, 25 words or less type of thing. Well, I'm a men's style writer, journalist, consultant, and I spent about 13 years of my career at the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation here in Canada, the national broadcaster. I worked there as a producer, mostly behind the scenes, although I did do some hosting on air, on radio, and a little bit on television. And about 10 years ago, I became very interested in modern masculinity, what it means to be a grown-up, which led me to my wardrobe, which led me to classic style. And a couple of years ago, I realized that this was more than a hobby or a passion, that I could combine, my career as a journalist with my passion. And I left the CBC to embark on a career, a freelance career as a journalist in this world. And that's where I've been for the last little while.
That's very, very exciting. So I read that you really like soccer, and obviously radio has been a big part of your life. How did you come from radio to men's style? Was there a particular point in time, or how did you get there?
There is actually one specific moment, which was soon after I became a father. I was holding my son, trying to get him to go to sleep. And he's looking up at me in that way that babies do, where it seems as if they're looking into your soul. And I realized that this would be, I would be his model for the rest of his life. I would be his role model of what it means to be a man, a grown-up, however you want to, identify it. Mm-hmm. But at that point, I really did not know what that meant. What does it mean to be a grown man in this day and age? And so I started looking at all these different aspects of my life. And because I was in radio, because I had, access as a producer and as a host, I started doing radio series about my journey of, partially self-discovery, but also about what's happening, the zeitgeist right now, about a whole generation of men who are asking themselves these kinds of questions. And, and I just sort of turned my lens, my microphone to every aspect of my life, whether it was my relationships, my hobbies, my skills, and eventually, of course, it fell to my wardrobe. I'd always been interested in dressing well, but I really did not have the knowledge or the guidance. But I guess I really didn't have the inspiration. And having a young son was finally that inspiration to get myself out of my adolescence and move into adulthood. And and then from then it's been even more discovery and constant. I mean, you know what this is like. You go through these rounds of you look into something, you kind of figure, you think, okay, I think I figured this out, and then you realize that's only one layer.
Exactly. There's so much more to it, and you can always dig deeper. And I think when you become a father, or when you just became a father, you also look back and look at, what did I learn from my father, and how did I learn? And you realize things that maybe you didn't think about before. So how did your father influence your style, or what kind of role model was he for you?
Well, my father immigrated here to Canada in the late 60s, a few years before I was born. And at the time, I know this from photos from when him and my mother came here, he was always well dressed. The classic 60s sort of slim suits, they were custom made. I mean, he did not have a lot of money when he lived in Portugal, but the little money that he had, he would put it into getting one or two nice pieces of clothes. And so they came to Canada, And like most Europeans at the time, when they would go out to, for instance, buy their groceries, my dad would put on a suit, my mom would dress up and do her makeup, and they went out into the streets of Toronto, and of course nobody was dressed like that here. It was very, very casual. And
Even in the 60s and
even
so
in the late 60s, compared to what it was like in Europe. And they didn't want to appear as outsiders, as obvious new immigrants. So they pretty much abandoned that stuff. So by the time I was born, my dad he was just wearing workwear. He was wearing, jeans and polo shirts and whatever. He would wear the occasional suit to a special event, or, occasionally, to church on Sunday and so on. But he certainly didn't, impose or pass on anything, because I didn't see it. I didn't see it day by day. I do remember the day that I turned 20, I was wearing a Grateful Dead t-shirt and jeans, and my dad said, I think it's time that you start dressing like a grown man. And, at the time I was like, whatever. But of course I didn't have necessarily an example, especially not, the way I look at it, the way I think of it now.
So what did you look like before you basically jumped on the train to classic man style?
Well, I'd say, I have worn ties, and I've had suits in my wardrobe since I was a teenager, but without really knowing what I was doing, there was a severe lack of elegance, a severe lack of subtlety, of knowledgeable restraint, let's say. And it was just far more casual. Like when I started at the CBC, this is going on 15, 16 years ago. At the time, I did have blue jeans in my wardrobe. As a soccer fan, I wore a lot of soccer jerseys. But in a way, what hasn't changed is that I was wearing my identity, and I knew I was wearing my identity.
Mm-hmm.
But my identity at the time was different. At the time, I also did a lot of cosplay, which is the anime costume conventions that go on, and I would dress up as some of my favorite characters.
Oh, wow. I've only seen them in person sometime in Asia and Singapore. I know there was a convention, and all of a sudden you saw all of these like super figures and heroes. One thing I noticed about you, you're always very enthusiastic. And when I ask you about your job, you don't just say one thing, you mention a number of things. Tell us more about the projects you've worked on in the past.
Yes, so like I said, it all started at the CBC, where I did a couple of radio series about modern masculinity, and then I followed that up with another series that was more about style and skills and so on. And what came out of that was a lot of men coming up to me and saying, I really appreciated that. I wish there were more opportunities for people to learn about these things. I'd love to learn more about, I did one 4 or 5 minute radio piece about shaving, about traditional wet shaving, and had all these men contacting me and saying, where can I buy these? And how do I learn more about it? And part of me, I'm thinking to myself, have you not heard of Google? But anyway, I realized that when it comes to a lot of these things, a lot of people do want a personal touch. They want to be able to see it happen in person. They want to ask questions. They want to interact in some way. And so I think I did my first class about 4 or 5 years ago, with a local friend who runs a men's vintage store. And we did a couple of classes. We did a building a wardrobe class, and we did a class on traditional shaving. I did the safety razor. He did the straight razor. And we had an excellent turnout. We had like 25 guys, who bought tickets and came to these events and wanted to watch other men shave. But I realized that there was this movement that was happening, this interest. So again, last year I did another series. A small group contacted me because they deal with young entrepreneurs. And they said it would be really great to teach that group of people just about, because they're learning about how to put together a business proposal, but they don't really know how to put themselves together.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I did a course on wardrobe. I did a course on shoe care. And I really, really enjoyed them. And, I realized that I do have a passion for talking to people and sharing this with people. So that always sits there as something that I can do. You know what I mean? Should the opportunity come up. But I also realized it's a very, very big job to put something like that together, and
A lot of work, right?
it's an enormous amount of work and planning and tickets and preparation and so on and so forth. And there was a time when I thought to myself, could that be what I'm going to do with myself? But again, I always kept coming back to the writing and the stories and the ideas, especially because when I left the CBC, I kind of dabbled in the world of being a stylist. And I realized that unless the person is interested in dressing exactly like me, I can't really, you know what I mean? I'm not going to give you advice on which hoodie you should wear with which, jean jacket. Like I'm not, and when it comes to contemporary brands and trends and so on and so forth, I'm just not interested. It's not something that I do. I can appreciate certain things from afar. So I realized that wasn't
On the table. Okay, it's good to know what doesn't work, right?
Exactly.
So what projects are you working on at the moment then?
One of the big projects that I'm working on that I started well over a year ago is I'm writing a book on the history of Canada's oldest tailor.
Wonderful.
Yes, it's a fantastic project that I couldn't have dreamed of a couple of years ago. But what partially because I found the idea of a book so daunting, but what I've done is I've just carved it up into a bunch of pieces, and then you put it together and it's a book. What's interesting about this tailor is that their history has intersected with the history of Toronto and with the history of Canada in so many ways. They were a military tailor as well as a civilian tailor. So there's a lot of stories from World War I, from World War II, from all the time in between and until today. They made uniforms for the very first transit workers in the city, all the way up to Harlan Sanders of Kentucky Fried Chicken. They made his white double-breasted suits in the 1970s when he lived in Canada for a while.
Do they still have those? Like, do they have a trial suit or a return or something of that?
Well, here's part of the issue and part of why this is such a Toronto story. They didn't keep very much of their history. They didn't keep very many photos. They didn't keep any records. Like the city of Toronto, the value of their own history, it didn't seem relevant. Toronto is synonymous, is notorious for knocking down all of our buildings, for destroying entire historic districts for the sake of progress, for the sake of modernity. And this company, unlike, for instance, many tailors on Savile Row, will have their paper patterns and especially their ledgers of customers stretching back hundreds of years. This company didn't. They didn't keep almost anything. So my job as a writer is also an enormous amount of research, because, for instance, the owner told me, oh yeah, my father said that we used to do the uniforms for the transit workers back in the turn of the century. So I have to dig in there and I have to go into the archives until I finally found the agreement that was kept by the TTC in 1921 for workers' uniforms. And there's his grandfather's signature.
In preparing for this interview, I looked at a lot of pictures of you, and I noticed that you like wearing hats. Why is that?
Well, the hat thing definitely goes back to when I was a kid. I've always been interested, obsessed with the 1930s and 40s, old-time radio. Ever since I was a very, very little kid. It was Sunday nights in Toronto on a radio station, Theater of the Mind, and old television, especially the Twilight Zone, old movies. And I just always found hats so elegant. But of course, growing up, there really wasn't, I will hold my hand up and say I was that teenager in a t-shirt and a fedora and a trench coat, thinking that I looked cool, but I absolutely did not. Mostly because, again, how I was wearing the fedora and the quality of the hat. And then a few years ago, I happened to hear about a hat maker here in Toronto. The company's name is Leon Drexler.
Stephen Temkin, right?
And, I couldn't believe that right here in Toronto, there is a hat maker. And at the time I was, starting to really get to know this industry. And I was at the CBC and I contacted him and said I would like to do a radio interview about his company and why he does it, because it's unusual that somebody does this in this day and age. Met him and discovered that we had a lot in common when it came to not just things sartorial, but our love of cigars and port wine and et cetera, et cetera. We've since become very good friends, and he has made me a number of hats now. But from that first experience, I learned that I believe many, many men do not wear hats because the hats that they try on are very poor quality and do not fit. And so they assume, oh, I just don't look good in hats.
It's similar with suits, right? If you wear like a suit that costs $100 new and it's glued and uncomfortable, you may easily think, oh, I don't like suits, they're uncomfortable, but you just don't know what's out there.
I mean, I think with suits and even with dress shoes, people still wear them because they are still worn. Very, very few men wear hats. So with suits, even though a guy may not like it, it may not fit, he doesn't know anything about it, he feels that he has to wear one for whatever reasons. Sure. That's not true with hats anymore. But when I had that first experience with Stephen, because I got a hat made for the radio piece, and he sat down with me and he looked at, not only the size of my head, the shape of my head, but my shoulders, my stance, the clothes that I wear, my wardrobe, my overcoats. He took all these things into consideration. It was like a holistic approach to one hat. And when I started wearing that hat, I never had a moment where somebody said, oh, you're wearing a hat. Instead, they said, that's a nice hat.
So do you smoke cigars?
Yes, I do.
How many do you smoke a month, would you say?
I would say, it varies winter and summer, right? And, in the summer, it might be a couple a week. In the winter, it's maybe only a couple a month.
It's cold in Toronto in the winter, so I can see that.
Very cold. So there isn't much smoking in the winter, because I do not smoke indoors. But in the summer, when the weather is nice enough, it's maybe one or two every week.
That's nice. And do you kind of pair it usually with some spirits or some port or Madeira, or do you just?
Yes, I have my favorite pairings, and they're usually seasonal. I find that in the colder months, I go towards port and Scotch. In the warmer months, it's much more lighter, refreshing drinks, whether it's mojitos or daiquiris or whatever. I'm also, being Portuguese, I've had port wine almost all my life, and recently I've discovered how good port wine can be.
Okay, so it seems like you like matured and aged things, right? The port, the cigars. How would you say does it translate to wardrobe items? Or what items would you say get better with age?
Well, definitely shoes. There's no question that I see the relationship. I see a very close relationship between tobacco, wine, and leather. In terms of the preparation, the process that they pass through, obviously the sensual aspects, whether it's the color or the smell, the feel to a certain extent. Like almost every cigar I've ever smoked in my life has had at least one hint of leather to it. But the way that leather ages, quality leather, the way that it ages, and this is in a sense the greatest problem with the state of, I would say, not the greatest problem, but one of the problems with the state of menswear today is that we have a generation of people newly discovering something that isn't as good as it will be a few years from now. Mm-hmm. For instance, they'll buy a brand new pair of shoes and they'll be disturbed that they're starting to crease, or they'll be disturbed that they're starting to wear, as opposed to, in 5 to 10 years, that's when that's really going to come to life. Much like, for instance, if you go to Cuba and buy a brand new cigar, you know what? You're actually going to have to put that in your humidor for at least 2 to 3 years, if not 5, to get the full enjoyment out of that. And our culture is very much about something we want it now. Instant gratification.
What are the things that you read? Like not necessarily clothing related, but in general.
I mean, I sort of make my regular visits to all the main sites I think that everybody else goes to, whether it's Simon's site,
Permanent Style, Simon Crompton.
you know, whether it's Parisian Gentleman, whether it's I'd have to look at my little
bookmarks.
List of the ones that I cycle through. I still visit Put This On. You know, every once in a while there's a great article about a classic piece on there, and then just, you know, I actually find a lot of stuff via social media, whether it's Instagram, whether it's Twitter, and articles that people have posted.
Knowing what you know today, what are the hallmarks of a well-dressed man?
I guess the fundamental one is intention.
Mm-hmm.
That I can see that the person has clearly chosen to do what they're doing and clearly thought about every piece and how they relate to each other and how they relate to the individual and how they relate to the occasion. Dressing for the occasion is very big for me, huge for me, and I, partially because we've lost sense of occasion.
But even when you think about it, it makes sense, right? I mean, people ask, "Oh, what's the best?" I'm always like, "Well, you got to take a step back. You know, where are you at? What's the purpose? You know, you cannot say this is the best for everything. That doesn't exist, right? It's like asking who's the best player for the team. Well, yeah, you could say Messi, but if you need a goalkeeper, Messi is not your man, right? It just doesn't work that way.
And you know, for instance, the best way to dress is arguably black tie, but it's not appropriate for every situation at all.
Exactly.
Tie itself is not necessarily appropriate for every situation. I regularly go camping, backwoods camping with my family, and you know, I dress appropriately to the occasion. I think people are used to that in certain things, you know, and I just try to apply that to every aspect of my life.
Let's say we talked about casual outfits. What would you say are good casual items that are not jackets, suits, or ties?
Well, I've become a big fan of very high quality polo shirts.
So who would that be for you? What brand would provide that for you?
Well, it's not a brand per se. It's more about a certain kind of cut, a certain kind of style. Like, for instance, the very typical polo shirt, whether short sleeve or long sleeve, has a ribbed collar.
Yeah.
Whereas the shirts that I've grown to love, it's the same fabric as it's the shirting. It's the same shirting. And the collar, in fact, is cut more like maybe it's a spread collar or, you know, a simple point collar. And the cuffs are constructed more like a regular shirt. It adds just a little sharpness to it, a little smartness to what is otherwise a very casual, sporty shirt. Mm-hmm. Even sports shirts themselves, you know, especially in the summer, button-down shirts is a very big thing for me. I love them. And again, there's a continuum between them and polo shirts. Popover shirts. So, you know, you just have the little placket that only goes a little bit down.
Like a polo shirt, kind of.
Again, and that one's like a hybrid of a polo shirt and a dress shirt. And when it comes to trousers, pretty much, you know, khakis, chinos of various colors. I don't own blue jeans.
So what would you say, you know, on the flip side, are the things that you would say are one of the best investments into your wardrobe?
Well, again, it comes down to shoes. I have a couple of pairs of shoes. I have a pair of Crockett & Jones boots and some Allen Edmonds brogues, as well as some tassel loafers that are just very, very well constructed shoes. I have a pair of custom shoes that I know are going to last, you know, for a very, very long time. Lately, I've been commissioning a lot of custom shirts, and, you know, a shirt, I think it's something that maybe people think of as sort of one of the last, because you don't really see much of it necessarily, and it doesn't seem that important. There's not as much construction as with a jacket. It's not as obvious, but it's actually, in a way, quite tricky to get a shirt absolutely right, because you don't have those other things to work with. You really only have the fabric. And when you find an excellent shirt, it can be not only comfortable but so flattering, for just such a simple piece. I've been, very proud. And then my hats from Stephen are pieces that, they just keep getting better and better with every season.
So how would you define Canadian style?
Well, unfortunately, it's really not possible to define Canadian style. I don't think. No, it's like Canadian culture in general. We define ourselves by what we aren't. We don't have a very specific cuisine. We don't have a specific, dress style. In so many ways, like our popular culture, it's connected to the United States. It's connected very strongly to England, to Britain. But it's neither, you know what I mean? It's neither those things exactly, nor so completely different, or something completely else.
Interesting.
So when it comes to style, basically, you would think after all these years of immigrant populations coming here, we would have taken something, we would have melded them into something, whether it's, because we had, waves of Irish tailors, Jewish, Polish, Italian, and still it was a sort of a bland, vaguely British cut for many years amongst the businessmen. You know what I mean? We didn't have the Ivy League movement. We didn't have the Brooks Brothers sack suit or any of that stuff that at least had a personality, a unique characteristic. We don't have any of those things. Hopefully something will develop, something global that nobody else has, because everyone else has their individual localized. But as of now, the best I can say is that we take a little bit of everything
and make it your own. Okay, that's a fair approach. So one thing we do, we ask everyone a certain amount of the same questions, just very quick answers, or you can elaborate whenever you want. But Oxford or Derby?
Derby.
Flannel or worsteds?
Well, always for me, flannel in the winter, and the worsteds are the fall, spring.
Necktie or bow tie?
I'd say it's probably 75% necktie, but I love me a good bow tie.
Belt or suspenders?
Again, depends on the trousers. Most of my trousers are with suspenders, higher rise, and they just fall better. But I have a fair number of casual trousers where I wear belts.
Okay. French cuff or barrel cuff?
Again, depends on the shirt. A lot of my day-to-day shirts are just regular barrel cuff. But I have a few of my sort of dressier shirts. I'm experimenting now where I'm getting single cuff shirts. Single cuffs made on many of my shirts, because it's a nice hybrid of the two.
So do you wear undershirts or no undershirts?
Always undershirts.
What kind of undershirt do you wear? Like the cutouts, or do you wear the V-necks, or?
It depends on the shirt. If I'm wearing a shirt open neck, I'll always wear a V-neck. But if I'm wearing a tie, then it's a crew neck shirt most of the time.
Okay. All right. Off the rack or bespoke?
It really depends on the individual item, the individual garment, and what it is that I'm going after. I would love to have almost everything made custom, but it's not always possible. But certain things, I don't think it makes sense to have them made custom. So it's really a blend of the two.
All right. Awesome. Thank you very much. Thanks for being on the show, and I'm sure it was very insightful. I enjoyed it very much, and all the best to you. And yeah, if you haven't been there, check out the Hogtownrake. It really isn't just about Toronto, but about the things Pedro mentioned, where he talks about the intention of dressing. And he also discusses shoe repair or how to iron a shirt. And it's overall a very well-made blog, and it's very intentional. Like, you approach things in a way that make you think about it, and I like that.
Thank you, Raphael. I appreciate your words, but I appreciate asking me to be on and talk to you, because known you for a couple of years, and respect what you do, and flattered that you would have me on.
Anytime, Pedro. Thank you.
Oh, anytime. Next Tuesday. Can we do it again?